Our planet is interconnected as never before, with unparalleled benefits and vulnerabilities. We rely on each other and compete with each other for almost everything. To avoid dangerous conflict, we need to look beyond our local interests to see the world through international focus. I'm Terry Phillips. On this program, we'll scratch beneath the surface and explore those things that tie us together or can drive us apart. Let's begin with a country that so often dominates our attention. What do we really know about Russia? For more than 1,000 years, Russia has survived wars and revolutions, from the Vikings of Northern Europe to the Mongols of Central Asia. This country grew through invasion and conquest, exploration and commerce, eventually becoming a global power, the largest nation on Earth. By the 19th century, Russia's vast empire extended more than halfway around the globe to this spot on the northern California coast. Fort Ross was established here to supply Russian colonists in Alaska with their agricultural needs and to hunt for fur seals. This settlement very nearly led to an alliance between the Tsar and the King of Spain. In fact, if not for a fluke of history, the land I'm standing on might have remained a part of Russia. I'll tell you that story at the end of this program. Today, Fort Ross is a restoration of that original settlement, effectively a museum operated by the California Parks Department. The Russians have left. So, why does all this matter? It matters because history influences current events. We'll see how Russia's past continues to affect its international relations, particularly with the United States, and we'll try to figure out where these two countries are headed. But first, let's focus on the Kremlin. This fortress at the heart of Moscow is the physical and symbolic seat of governance in Russia, overlooking Red Square and St. Basil's Cathedral. From inside these walls, from monarchs to Bolsheviks to now, Russian rulers have been deciding the fate of their nation. This complex houses some of the country's most valued treasures and serves as official residence for the head of state. Beyond infrastructure, the Kremlin represents Russia itself. The question of national identity can be complicated. Professor Andrei Tsigankov was born in the USSR. He teaches political science at San Francisco State University. I asked him to explain what it means to be Russian.
Of course, Russia today is different from the Soviet Union. Ethnically, today, 80% or more of people who live in Russia are ethnic Russians, whereas in the Soviet Union it was 50-50. And that's not insignificant because Russia historically has been framed and shaped by a Slavic population, by those who came to Eurasia from Eastern Europe, as we gather. They preserved their own ethnic identity, but they became also, in many respects, intermixed with other multicultural. And then, of course, Russia became Christian in 10th century, in the early 10th century. And so Russians became, in many ways, for centuries, became Orthodox Christians, all the way until the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, after 74 years of communist rule. Sergei Petrov is a career diplomat.
For sure.
He's now Russia's consul general in San Francisco. We talked about the role of national identity in foreign relations. What is your country? I know it's been the Russian Empire, I know it's been part of the USSR, I understand it's the Russian Federation, but how do you explain to a non-Russian what is Russia?
It is not an easy question, but to put it briefly, for me it's my motherland. It's the country where I was born and where I grew up. So if I start explaining about my country to any other person, I would say that it's the best place in the world, that it's a country with wonderful people, and that anywhere you go in Russia you would get comfortable, you would be welcome, and it goes without doubt about any place in Russia and any people from outside.
It's the bastard child of the USSR.
Masha Gessen was born in the Soviet Union. She studied in the United States, went back to Moscow as a journalist, and wrote 2 books critical of Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. She now lives in America again.
Comparing it to the USSR is a little bit of a thankless pursuit because we immediately get into the distinctions. And there are important distinctions. You know, there isn't official censorship. The media are dominated by the state, but they don't actually have censors clearing every piece of writing. Apparently, that's not necessary to exert near total control over the media. For the moment, the borders are open. And for the small number of people who do take advantage of it, that's a huge difference between life 40 years ago and life now. But I think it's much more important and much more informative to talk about Russia on its own terms. I mean, Russia is an authoritarian state that is fast becoming a totalitarian state. It's a police state. It's a state that controls its population through fear. It's a state where there hasn't been public conversation in 13 years since the state took over the media. That's a whole generation that has grown up in the absence of any kind of public politics or public conversation. It's a pretty sad place, and it's a scary place.
Markos Kounalakis is a longtime friend and colleague. We both reported from Eastern Europe and the collapsing Soviet Union during the 1990s. He's now a syndicated columnist and a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. I talked with Markos in his San Francisco apartment. When you and I were watching the last red hammer and sickle flag lowered from the Kremlin rooftop, I turned to you and I said, so it's no longer the USSR. What is it now? And you, without missing a beat, said it's not the USSR, it's the new SSR. Is it still the new SSR? Or again, maybe, the new SSR?
You know, it's changed. There's no question that the country, well, first of all, it doesn't exist, right? The breaking up of that empire is complete. There are remnants of that. And what happens in any development or any change geopolitically is that there are remnants of things past, and then there are pressures of new things to replace whatever that was. So you have remnants of nostalgia for what once was, whether it was empire or superpower status, and that goes both from the leadership down to, you know, your average worker who felt in some way the way that people feel about their own team, right? They want it to win. They want it to be first. They don't like being, you know, they don't like to being Chicago Cubs fans, right? Or, unless you're from Chicago, right? But I mean, you want to go to the World Series every once in a while, right? And or at least have the shot at it. And especially if you've been there.
One key to understanding national identity is through journalism. That's as true in Russia as it is in the United States. Of course, not every media agency is truly independent. What some would call state or corporate-sponsored speech, others view as propaganda. Let's see what Yekaterina Zabrovskaya thinks about all this. We'll get her on Skype here.
Hi, Terry.
Hi, Yekaterina. How are you?
How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are things in Moscow?
Excellent. Thank you.
Good. You know, most of our viewers won't know very much about Russia Direct. You're the editor-in-chief. Tell me about this organization, please.
So Russia Direct is a new analytical outlet. We were launched in June of 2013. Our main focus is on Russian foreign policy and Russia's role in the world and Russia-US relations.
Would you say that what you do is journalism? You're a journalist, I know, but is Russia Direct a news organization?
It's not a news organization. It's an analytical media outlet, but yeah, I would call it journalism, of course.
Okay. So tell me about the news standards. You're familiar with U.S. News standards and those in other countries. Tell me about Russian news standards. Are they the same? Are they different?
Well, I would say that Russian media market is very much like media market in the world, in other countries, in America and Europe. So, you know, if we're talking about news coverage, the focus is on the speed. It is very important to be first. It is sensationalism. And, you know, if we're talking about TV, it's a good picture and, you know, great quotes, emotional quotes. I don't watch Russian TV or try not to treat it seriously because they have a different goal in mind, and in many cases I can't call it good reporting or good journalism.
Journalism as a profession has existed in Russia in the last quarter century. It's disappearing. It's an endangered species, but it has existed in Russia, and it's been an extremely dangerous profession. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, it's one of the most dangerous countries to be a journalist. It's probably the most dangerous country that is officially at peace. It also consistently ranks among the highest countries on the CPJ's impunity index. So not only are you likely to be killed or attacked for practicing your profession, it's also extremely unlikely that whoever kills or attacks you will be punished.
In Masha Gessen's account of the feminist punk rock protest group Pussy Riot, as well as in her earlier investigative biography of Russia's president, she portrays Putin's leadership as being tyrannical. Markos Kounalakis agrees and talks about potential fallout from that authoritarian rule.
I think it's hard for Putin to find a way out that is not more repressive, that is not more restrictive, because while in the short term it may not seem as if he's going to have much economic challenge to what it is he wants to do, I think in the long term it's actually going to cost him. And as those pressures build, the only reaction will be that of more repression and control.
So I want to read you a quotation from Winston Churchill, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's from a speech he gave on October 1st, 1939. And he said, quote, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is," the famous part, "it is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But," he goes on, "perhaps there is a key, and that key is Russian national interest." So, what is Russian national interest?
What he means is that the Soviet Empire's borders roughly correspond with the borders of the Russian Empire. And so Russia has had its own major geopolitical interests and cultural interests in the Balkans. It wanted to have an understanding with the Ottoman Empire. It wanted to have its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe.
What it referred to as the near abroad.
Near abroad now, right. So that is something that Churchill had in mind when he said that Russia's national interests are the key. That Russians will not fight, for example, for Syria, they will not fight for Northern Africa, but they will fight for Ukraine. This is crucial to them. This is their near abroad, this is their sphere of influence, this is their geopolitical sense of where their interests are. And what Russians are doing now also, after the end of the Cold War, they are global They are trying to conduct global foreign policy, but primarily for the purpose of preserving its control, its influence over this area of Eurasia, former Soviet Union, and Ukraine, of course, is the absolute priority. For Russians, Ukraine is crucial for so many reasons. Geopolitically, it's their window to Europe. This is how they connect to Europe. Major pipelines go through Europe, to Europe through Ukraine as well. Culturally, Russians and Ukrainians are extremely close. Their language is close, it's the same religion. The roots of Russian culture are in Kiev, as we discussed earlier. So that is similar to what Jerusalem is to different confessions. So Kiev to Russia is just as important as it is to many Ukrainians for these reasons. And so Russians are willing to accept Ukrainian independence, but so long as there are close relationships preserved, so long as Russia's economic, cultural, political interests are respected in Kiev. And if they are not, then there will be further problems, and that's something that we are already experiencing right now.
Let's talk about the relationship between the United States and Russia, because that's really where I'm headed with all of this. How do you see things today, and how do you see things going forward?
Well, Terry, what I see today is kind of disturbing, and I'm really not sure where the relationship is going. This is definitely the worst crisis between Russia and the US since the end of the Cold War. It's hard to predict whether the relationship will be in a state of a new Cold War, as some experts today say they warn against a new Cold War, or this will be just a temporary crisis. Frankly, for me, it is hard to say.
Marcos, let's talk about the Cold War.
I remember that.
We remember when it was declared over.
Yeah.
Looking back, was that declaration premature?
The problem with the Cold War is it was undefined in many ways. I mean, we knew viscerally what it meant, and there were borders that were changed as a result of the end of the Cold War. But the war itself lacked a certain definition, right? And so what did the end of that war look like? Well, it wasn't the end of hostilities, per se, because hostilities really never manifested themselves in that war. That's why it was a Cold War. It's something that in some ways had its own momentum, and you saw that in policy areas, you saw that in military directions, you even saw it in popular attitudes and orientations. But had something very definitive changed? No question. I mean, the opening and the allowance of those who were previously within the captive states of Eastern Europe, and certainly those who were within the former Soviet states, suddenly had a lot more freedom of movement. It also meant a freedom to lose their life savings, a freedom to lose their jobs because of sudden opening to competitive and capital pressures. The free market is not fair. It's not a fair market. It's very efficient in many ways, but it's not very fair in other ways. And those people who were living in those circumstances previously were unable to contend with the challenges of this new world, of this post-Cold War era.
What does that do for Russians, and what does that do for Russian-American relations?
Well, what that does for Russians is it creates something that they've lacked for a generation, which is a sense of national identity and a sense of their mission in the world. That's scary, because that's what's creating support for Russian aggression, and that's what's creating the kind of support that will last even beyond the negative consequences for the Russian economy, and people will just tighten their belts and continue to support the war effort, and this may last a long time. And what that means for the United States is that it's it can keep saying this is not a new Cold War and we're not fighting a Cold War all at once, but that's not the case. I mean, it's not a new Cold War in the sense that it's something else, but it's something else that is as frightening and as global in its implications as the Cold War was.
Some people have said to me that they believe this is perhaps the greatest crisis in Russian-American relations since the end of the Cold War. Do you agree with that?
Since the end of the Cold War, probably. But if we look at the Caribbean crisis,
Which Americans call the Cuban Missile Crisis, just to be clear.
Yes. It was much more dangerous from what I knew, from what I learned. As I was told that Americans were being prepared for a nuclear attack on behalf of the Soviet Union, and. But as far as I know, Soviet Union never planned such an attack.
The American policy has been shaped around this image that Putin needs to be contained. We need to put in place a new deterrence, a new Cold War policy. We need to assume that Russia is after Ukraine, that Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union, and that's Hillary Clinton and others making these remarks. And Russia, in the meantime, thinks that Americans are out to get them. There is a very strong feeling in the Kremlin that the United States really wants a regime change, that it does not want to deal with Putin. As long as this guy is in power, we cannot get anything done. And what does it mean? That means that we don't recognize Russia for what it is. That's the problem.
It's troubling.
It's troubling.
Because both sides are wrong.
It's madness, Terry. That's what it is.
You're not advocating regime change in the way this term came to be known in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan. Certainly you're not advocating that kind of outcome, or that kind of process, I should say.
And not forcible regime change, no. And in fact, what you're seeing in the first stages of reaction to the Ukraine crisis is a targeted attempt at least isolating the leadership, Putin and his cadre of friends. And
is there not a third way? Some kind of reconciliation that goes beyond these two choices?
Sure. I mean, but today in our international system, you require the leaderships of nations in international relations to be able to come to agreement and to be able to sign treaties, for example, or come to terms. It doesn't go to a popular vote.
What can we as journalists do to make lives in our own countries better? Anything?
That's a great question. I do believe that journalists have a power of improving the relations between Russia and the US. I think that by reporting fairly, by presenting facts, and by presenting both sides, or the opinions on both sides, we can first improve mutual understanding between our countries. Second, we can eliminate stereotypes that affect our relations so badly. And third, we can kind of help both countries treat each other with respect.
Can you be optimistic
I can't be optimistic. I'm extremely pessimistic. And I'm pessimistic because I think that what I didn't realize in the 90s, when I was optimistic, was just how much damage living in a totalitarian society does to the soul and to the very fabric of society.
The present situation is pretty tense in our relationship, but again, I'm an optimist, and I believe that we would be able to negotiate, and we would be able to understand, and we will be able to find a common ground in this situation and in many more situations that could arise.
Fort Ross still holds a special appeal for many Russians. They appreciate its historical significance, and perhaps a bit more than that. On this day, I meet Vadim, who is from the town of Izhevsk. It's his first visit to Fort Ross. Sergei was born in Moscow, but now lives in America. He's been here 4 times.
Американцы сохранили все-таки это вот достояние, и тут и наша какая-то история русская, и Америка все-таки это сохранила все. Мне очень, очень радостно, что действительно так.
Если я хорошо понимаю, это место, где американец и русский хорошо работал
Да.
вместе.
Да.
А сейчас как вы думаете, как вы видите?
Сейчас я вижу полный упадок отношений.
Ну да. Сейчас плохо.
И последний вопрос. Мы, Россия и Америка, мы куда пойдем?
Я думаю, что в конце концов будет все хорошо. Вот. Сейчас пока, да, трудный период. Но
Долго дорога.
Я думаю, что люди же у нас стали больше общаться уже между собой. От людей же тоже что-то зависит.
Вы оптимист?
Я оптимист, потому что иначе чем тогда жить? Вот. Период это кончится.
Вы оптимист для нас и
Для
тоже
себя.
для вашей страны?
Да, конечно, конечно. Ну, ведь вечно ничего не длится. Охлаждение тоже вечно не будет. Я считаю, что будет все хорошо. Ну, может быть, не в этом году, и не в следующем.
How do great powers avoid conflict? Once upon a time, international alliances were forged through marriage. 200 years ago, here in Northern California, Russia's envoy, Nikolai Petrovich Rezanov, fell in love with Maria Concepcion Arguello, the daughter of the Spanish governor. He was 42. She was only 15. Before getting married, Nikolai headed to St. Petersburg to see the Tsar. But along the way, while riding through Siberia, he fell ill and died. There would be no marriage and no Russian-Spanish treaty. Today, nations have other ways of forging alliances. Global organizations, while far from perfect, give countries a chance to meet and discuss their differences. Adversaries often work together. But misunderstandings can lead to miscalculations, sometimes with catastrophic results. That's why it is so important to look for common interests rather than opposing positions. I believe this requires keeping an open mind and an international focus.
Well, I can tell you political jokes if you like. Here is one about Putin's visit to Germany, and that's a tough guy joke about Putin. He comes to a German restaurant. He's with his entourage. A German waiter immediately approaches him and says, "What would you like to eat?" And Putin says, "Meat." "And what about vegetables?" Putin looks around his entourage and says, "They will eat meat too."